Good morning, everyone, and welcome virtually to the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute's spring event. My name is Neil Kashkari, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Fed Research Division is the home to the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. We founded the Institute in January 2017, just over 5 years ago, with the goal of bringing more focused research attention to economic disparities, both in our region and around the country. Of course, the Federal Reserve's dual mandate is both maximum employment and stable prices. It was the maximum employment side of that dual mandate that was the original inspiration for the Institute, when we realized that just looking at the aggregate employment statistics did not give us enough insight into what was happening in the labor market. Today's event is focused on the other side of our dual mandate, which is inflation. Today's event focuses on the unequal effect inflation is having on families across the country. It's going to explore ways that inflation puts different pressures on workers and families depending on where they live, what they earn, and how they spend. In 4 short presentations, our panelists today will outline key facts from new research into disparities in how Americans experience inflation. Conversations will follow on how policymakers at all levels should respond to these facts. Audience questions are, of course, welcomed and can be submitted today via the Q&A feature. We hope that you and all of us will leave with a clearer understanding of what the impacts of rising prices are and how they can be felt differently from person to person and family to family across the country. Now, whether you are a policymaker, a service provider, or an American engaged on economic issues, it is important to appreciate how broad-based phenomenon like rising price levels filters through the plumbing of our economy and our society to land on individuals differently. This type of analysis is critical to our work at the Fed. Today's event is a great illustration of how a focused research initiative like the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute can contribute to the Fed's policymaking mission, informing us about the broader context in which our decisions affect families across the country. Now, I am really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Governor Lael Brainard. Governor Brainard took office as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in June 2014. Even before her appointment to the Board of Governors, Governor Brainard had a distinguished record of public service, holding senior roles at the U.S. Treasury Department and the White House, both in the Obama and Clinton administration, and early on as a recipient of the prestigious White House Fellowship. Governor Brainard has also been a vice president and founding director of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institute and has been a professor of MIT's Sloan School of Management. After her remarks, Governor Brainard will be joined by Dr. Abigail Wozniak, director of the Institute and a senior economist here at the Minneapolis Fed. Dr. Wozniak will offer some questions of her own to Governor Brainard and then take questions from the audience submitted again through the Q&A feature. Governor Brainard, we are so pleased to have you here with us. The floor is now yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's always a pleasure for me to join Neil Kashkari and Abigail Wozniak at Minneapolis's Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. And I'm particularly looking forward to the research discussions today. By law, the Federal Reserve is assigned the responsibility to pursue price stability and maximum employment. Maximum employment and stable low inflation benefit all Americans, but are particularly important for low and moderate income families. Low and moderate income families expend a greater share of their income on necessities, have smaller financial cushions, and may have less ability to switch to lower priced alternatives. Today, inflation is very high, particularly for necessities such as food and gasoline. And while all Americans are confronting higher prices, the burden's particularly great for those households that have more limited resources. That's why getting inflation down is our most important task while sustaining a recovery that includes everyone. That's vital to sustaining the purchasing power of American families. In assessing inflation faced by American consumers, most people rely on the change in the consumer price index, the CPI, or the change in the price index for personal consumption expenditures, the PCE. The Federal Reserve specifies our 2% longer run price stability goal in terms of annual PCE inflation. And both of those measures are assembled from a collection of underlying price indices for narrow subsets of goods and services. The price changes each month for those subsets are combined into measures of overall inflation by calculating a weighted average, where the weights are based on average aggregate consumer expenditures. Using that national average of consumer expenditures to weight the categories for purposes of calculating overall inflation is very useful. For instance, in looking at how much real growth might have occurred between two periods. But that approach has limitations when it comes to representing the actual cost of living experienced by different types of households. Because both CPI and PCE inflation weight every dollar of expenditure equally, those measures implicitly weight each household's cost of living proportionally to their total expenditure. Since lower income households represent a relatively smaller share of overall expenditure, the inflation associated with their consumption is underrepresented in the official consumer price indices. There are several reasons households at different income levels could experience differential inflation effects. I think the panelists today will go into greater detail on this. I'll briefly touch on four possible reasons. First, low and moderate income households could experience inflation that is different from the average because their consumption baskets differ from the average. Lower income households spend 77% of their income on necessities, more than double the 31% of income spent by higher income households on necessities. And several studies have found that the consumption baskets of lower income households have experienced higher than average inflation over time. Research from the BLS in particular has examined the effect of different consumption baskets by using those same price indexes for the subsets of goods, but assigning the weights of the components to reflect the different consumption bundles of different types of households. A recent working paper based on data over the last 20 years found that a price index reflecting the consumption basket for households in the lowest income quartile grew faster than the overall CPI, while a price index reflecting the consumption basket for households in the highest income quartile grew more slowly than the overall CPI. And a similar result has been found for earlier periods. While these studies allow for differences in the weighting of price indexes for different income groups, they rely on the same elementary price indexes for those subcategories of goods and services, so they may miss additional sources of variation in the inflation experienced by households at different income levels. That brings me to the second reason. Households with different levels of income may purchase significantly different items within each consumption category. And to take an extreme example, caviar and canned tuna are both in the same elementary index, but of course this demand and supply dynamics for those components are likely quite different, meaning that their relative price dynamics may be poorly described by that single price index. Third, households at different income levels may have different abilities to substitute for lower priced alternatives. Consider an increase for a breakfast cereal that increases the prices of both the brand name cereal and its lower priced store brand generic, but maintains a differential between them. A household that had been purchasing the brand name cereal could save money simply by purchasing the store brand cereal, perhaps eliminating any effect of the price increase on their spending while purchasing the same quantity of cereal. However, a household that was already purchasing the store brand would have to either absorb the increase in cost or consume less within that category. And finally, differences in inflation can result from households paying different prices for identical goods due to differences in access. Using transaction level data, researchers found that almost 2/3 of the variation in inflation across households comes from differences in prices paid for identical goods, with the remaining 1/3 coming from the differences in the mix of goods within broad categories. As a result of these differences in prices paid for the same good, households with lower incomes, more household members, or older household heads experience higher inflation on average. Those variations in prices paid for identical goods could reflect differences in the ability of some households to stock up when prices are discounted or to buy in bulk and save, options that may be available only to households with the means to buy in larger quantities, adequate capacity to store larger quantities, or the flexibility to delay purchases if there is likely to be a lower price in the future. In addition, inflation appears to be lower for items purchased online rather than from brick and mortar stores, suggesting that households who don't have full access to online shopping could also face a higher cost of living. One study of online transactions between 2014 and 17 found that online inflation averaged more than 1 percentage point per year lower than the equivalent inflation measure of brick and mortar average inflation. In sum, while this field is rapidly developing, a variety of research approaches reach similar conclusions. High inflation places a burden on working families who are concerned about how far their paychecks will stretch, as well as seniors living on fixed incomes. So now let me turn briefly to what we're seeing on inflation before finishing with a word on policy. In February, headline PCE inflation came in at 6.4% on a 12-month basis. Within that, food and energy account for an outsized 1/4 share of the high level of inflation, and it also constitutes an outsized share of expenditure for low-income households who spend about 26% of their income on food at home and transportation, compared with 9% for high-income households. Core inflation is also elevated, and inflationary pressures have been broadening. Housing contribute about 1/10 of total PCE inflation in February, and is also the single greatest category of expenditures by far for lower income Americans who spend 45% of their income on housing, compared to 18% for higher income Americans. Durable goods inflation, particularly in autos, accounted for slightly more than 1/5 of total PCE inflation, representing a much greater contribution than pre-pandemic. That high durable goods inflation reflects pandemic-related supply constraints as well as persistently elevated demand. I will be carefully monitoring the extent to which demand rotates back to services and away from durable goods, where it's been consistently above pre-pandemic levels, and the extent to which the services sector can absorb that higher demand without generating additional inflationary pressures. Of course, the global commodity supply shock associated with Russia's invasion of Ukraine skews inflation risks to the upside and is expected to exacerbate high prices for gasoline and food, as well as supply chain bottlenecks. And the recent COVID lockdowns in China are also likely to extend those bottlenecks. Those events also pose downside risks to growth, but the US economy entered this period with considerable momentum in demand and a strong labor market. As of the March labor report, payroll employment has increased by 600,000 jobs per month over the past 6 months, which is very strong, and the unemployment rate has fallen by a percentage point over the same period. But until recently, the recovery in labor force participation was lagging far behind. So it was really nice to see the pandemic constraints on labor supply appear to be diminishing. The prime age participation rate jumped by 0.7 percentage points, a large increase for women in March, following a similar sized large increase for men in February. An increase in labor supply associated with diminishing pandemic constraints, combined with a moderation in demand associated with tightening financial conditions, slowing foreign growth, and a large decrease in fiscal support, could be expected to reduce imbalances later in this year. And that brings me finally to saying a few words on policy. For all the reasons we've just talked about, it's of paramount importance to get inflation down. Accordingly, the committee will continue tightening monetary policy methodically through a series of interest rate increases and by starting to reduce the balance sheet at a rapid pace as soon as our May meeting. Given that the recovery has been considerably stronger and faster than in the previous cycle, I expect the balance sheet to shrink considerably more rapidly than in the previous recovery, with significantly larger caps and a much shorter period to phase in the maximum caps compared with 2017 to 19. That reduction in the balance sheet will contribute to monetary policy tightening over and above the expected increases in the policy rate reflected in market pricing and the committee's own projections. I expect the combined effect of rate increases and balance sheet reduction to bring the stance of policy to a more neutral position later this year, with the full extent of additional tightening over time, depending on how the outlook for inflation and employment evolves. Our communications have resulted in broad market expectations for an expeditious increase in the policy rate toward a neutral rate and a more rapid reduction in the balance sheet compared with 2017 to 19. Consistent with these expectations, we've already seen significant tightening in the market financing conditions at longer maturity that tend to be the most relevant for household and business decision making. And we have only to look at the 30-year fixed mortgage rate to see the levels there increasing to levels we last saw in early 2018. So let me wrap up by simply saying that the committee is committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% target, recognizing that stable low inflation is vital to maintaining a strong economy and a labor market that works for everyone. And let me hand over now to Abigail Wozniak.
Thank you, Governor Brainard. That was a really clear delineation of all of the challenges in measuring something that I think to a lot of us seems simple, just seems like one number that we hear a lot about, but a great deal goes into it. And there's a great deal of complexity in trying to think through how that might work for different folks. So I'm so pleased that you could lay that out. And I'm so grateful that you can take a few questions. I'd like to encourage the audience to put questions in the Q&A. If you are logged on to the Zoom webinar, I will try to monitor them there and hope that we can get one or two of those in as well. But I wanted to start out asking, coming back to your point about the labor market and wage growth. And as we know, the labor market in the US is quite tight right now, particularly in the last few readings. So do you see wages rising to compensate for the inflation that we've seen? And how do you see that working for different segments or parts of the labor market?
Yeah, so that question goes also to the very different experiences that many different Americans are having because wage gains have been just as differentiated across sectors and across parts of the income spectrum as those rates of inflation. And of course, one would want to know both in order to really gauge how purchasing power is being affected for different groups of Americans. So we have seen the fastest decline in unemployment in any previous recovery of the past several decades, reflecting very strong labor demand. And until recently, it appeared labor supply was still very constrained by the pandemic. Fortunately, in recent months, we've also seen a strong improvement in labor force participation, which is very encouraging. But with that labor demand outstripping the pandemic-related slower labor supply response, wages have been rising considerably over the past year. Those wage gains have been broad-based across industries and demographics, but the gains have been strongest for those at the lower end of the wage distribution. And actually, given the high level of average inflation over the past year, just looking at it from the perspective of average inflation, real wage gains have only been experienced generally by lower wage workers. As the economy's reopened, we've seen that increase in wage growth, particularly for lower income workers, consistent with the rebound in demand in those sectors. And that has been coupled with constraints on labor supply that also seem most acute in those sectors. Using data from ADP, Federal Reserve staff is able to calculate percent wage changes over the past 12 months following the same worker. And that evidence suggests that most low-wage workers, especially in the bottom quartile, have seen wage growth that exceeds average inflation, which we talk about as real wage growth. So their purchasing power has actually increased somewhat. But for the majority of workers overall, it appears that wage growth has fallen short of overall consumer price inflation. Then if you look instead at earnings by sector, it also appears lower wage earners or earners in sectors that generally pay lower wages have also seen the greatest wage gains and are more likely to have experienced increases in purchasing power, whereas overall purchasing power, as measured by the increase in average wages over average inflation, has fallen. And so the sectors that experienced the largest gains in the 12 months ending in February were also three of the sectors that have generally low pay: leisure and hospitality, transportation, warehousing, and retail trade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So coming back again to the point about real purchasing power, one of the main reasons we worry about inflation, and we spend so much time measuring it, is because we think it has costs of some kind. Certainly it affects the bottom line in terms of what families and workers can purchase. But what do you see? There's a variety of ways it can affect things for our economy. And so what do you see as the most important costs that inflation imposes? And are we capturing those costs with our measurements?
Yeah, so we do think about purchasing power. And that is why our dual mandate, I think, is so important, because it allows us to take into account both the job opportunities and wage opportunities that are facing different workers in the U.S. economy, but also how much they're paying, what their cost of living is. And those two things together are really their purchasing power. High inflation is significantly erodes household purchasing power. And I think that's why low stable inflation is such a core part of the Federal Reserve's mandate, and why that 2% inflation longer run target is so embedded in our framework. The effect of high inflation appears to be most damaging for households with tight budget constraints. That includes seniors with fixed incomes, as well as lower income working Americans. Surprise increases inflation. And so, you can think about both, some of the price increases we saw in used vehicles, for instance, which were associated with the pandemic, but really they were much larger than anybody expected, or the kinds of increases we're seeing now on food and prices at the pump from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Those are very difficult for households that are managing against tight budget constraints and have little flexibility. And that's why there's that emphasis on how big primary necessities are as a share of overall income. For low-income families, with more than 3/4 of their income taken up by necessities, when the price of those necessities go up, there's really very little they can do to substitute or to cushion. And similarly, as we were talking about the ability to move to lower price generics or to stock up and save, those kinds of cushions are somewhat less available to certain families. And so their purchasing power is likely to be eroded more. And then I guess I would also say that any buffer that lower income households have is more likely to be held in cash or in a savings account. So unexpected inflation is also going to erode the value of that more than those who might be holding assets that hold their value better during a surprise inflationary surge. And as you're going to continue talking about with your panelists, our average inflation numbers are really important indicators, but they don't capture those differential effects adequately.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that a little bit. Why do you think it's important for the Fed to understand those distributional aspects? Like you mentioned, I think there's so many great connections with what the panelists will follow up on. What they're trying to do with our measurements is really a pretty complicated comparison of people who are, either socially very far apart or even far apart in time. We're trying to make these direct comparisons using these measurements. So why do you think it's important for us to have a handle on those distributional differences from the Fed's perspective?
Well, I think we benefit tremendously from understanding both sectoral, regional, and demographic differences in the way different Americans are experiencing the economy. So, we've had an emphasis in the last few years through outreach, through Fed Listens, through a lot of our community affairs work at the board, through our Community Affairs Council, in understanding that those aggregate statistics, they're critically important for us, but that they don't really tell a very full story about how individual communities are experiencing both employment and inflation, which again together make up purchasing power. And so what we learned in the course of the recovery, the last recovery, when inflation was low and stable, is that there was a lot more ability to expand the labor force than you might have realized just looking at the aggregate statistics. And we learned that by understanding individual experiences of the labor market. And similarly, right now, I think we can all absolutely agree inflation is too high, and bringing inflation down is of paramount importance. But understanding that food and energy, for instance, might be the single most visible and problematic form of inflation for some, where we have a little less ability through our policy, or housing might be by far the biggest component of inflation for other households, where the Fed's tools do have a real effect. So it's extremely important for us to understand the differences across different American communities.
And I'm really glad that we've gotten to a couple of things that have come up in the Q&A. So you mentioned the geopolitical situation. You've talked a bit about Fed Listens and our outreach to communities. Those were both subjects of questions that folks submitted. There have also been a couple of questions on just the next steps and the future of Fed policy. So you made the point that kind of no matter how we measure it, inflation is too high. And so I'm wondering if you can just describe really kind of the next important steps you see for the Fed in this coming year in terms of addressing that as maybe our final question.
Yeah, well, I think you said it well, that inflation is very high, and high inflation imposes a burden on all Americans, particularly those with more limited resources. So getting inflation down is our most important task, while also sustaining the recovery to include everyone. As we were discussing earlier, in February, total PCE inflation was over 6.25%. And that's very high and far above our 2% goal. We think that the Russia invasion is going to further boost prices for food and for gasoline, and of course there are upside risks there. And against that background, we're going to deploy both of our tools to address that high inflation. The committee's already taking action. I anticipate it'll be appropriate to continue tightening monetary policy methodically through a series of interest rate increases, and by starting to reduce the balance sheet at a rapid pace as soon as the May meeting. The shrinkage in the balance sheet is likely to take place at a considerably more rapid pace than previously, because the recovery is significantly more rapid than previously, and that would take place through a significantly larger caps and a much shorter period to phase in those caps. Of course, every meeting will have the opportunity to calibrate the appropriate pace of firming through the policy rate to reflect what the incoming data is telling us. We're prepared to take stronger action if measures of inflation and inflation expectations indicated that that's warranted, but I'm also attentive to signals from the yield curve at different horizons and from other data that might suggest increased downside risks to the economy.
Well, Governor Brainard, I want to echo President Kashkari's earlier sentiments. We are so grateful and excited that you were able to join us this morning and help kick off this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Appreciate it.
And I encourage folks, Governor Brainard's remarks will be linked to from our event website, so you can look for them there. I'm going to turn now to our panel. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our expert panel for more discussion on this issue. Each of our panelists actually will be following up in different ways on a number of things that Governor Brainard alluded to in her address. And they'll be sharing highlights from recent research into some of the ways and to what extent inflation and price changes land unequally across American households. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to present, and we'll follow that with a moderated discussion with all panelists led by Greg Ip of the Wall Street Journal. So I'm going to briefly introduce each panelist as they come on screen, but for more information on them and their work, please see the links and bios on our event website. You can also find briefs there summarizing each of the panelists' presentations as well. So our first panelist is Jordan Conwell, and Professor Conwell joins us from UT Austin, where he is an assistant professor of sociology and an affiliate of the Population Research Center. And if you are ready, Professor Conwell, go ahead and share your slides, and the floor is yours.
Right. Okay, are folks seeing slides?
Yes, great.
Okay. Morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. Abby, again, my name is Jordan Conwell. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and an affiliate of the Population Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Today, I am going to be talking about how low-income families spend money and potential impacts of inflation. As I've mentioned, I'm a sociologist. I really appreciate the Minneapolis Fed broadening the disciplines of social scientists who get to talk to these groups. I see it as my job today to kind of provide a little bit of context, and then I'll clear the way for my colleagues from economics. And a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about, I think, actually provide a bridge between Governor Brainard's remarks and the other things that my fellow panelists will be discussing. So what I'm going to be talking about today is mostly based on a piece that was published at the end of last year in EconoFact with some colleagues of mine, Lisa Genetian, who is a professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke and an applied economist, as well as Becca Daniels, who's a PhD candidate there in the Sanford School. And I think this link will be made available to panelists and attendees if you want to take a look at that piece. So I'll be talking about some findings from that piece, as well as some other things that I think are relevant to today's conversation that did not end up making it into that piece that's available on EconoFact. So I'm not going to be talking about the entire population of US households. I'm going to be talking about a specific subpopulation, families that are A, low income, and B, have at least one child under 18 in the household. And I'll talk a little bit about why that population we think is of particular relevance to today's conversation. I'll talk briefly about the data that we're going to use, the Consumer Expenditure Survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And in terms of results, I'll be talking about these households' average monthly expenditures over the period of 2015 to 2019. So this is post-Great Recession, pre-COVID, and the contemporary economic conditions that we're seeing, although I'll be talking about some potential impacts of the conditions that we're seeing today. So this will be kind of a description of the basket of goods for a household of this type. So really trying to put some numbers on that. A particular interest of my own research is intersections of race and economic conditions, in this case, intersections of race and poverty. So I'll also be talking briefly about how this basket does or does not look different for poor households with children by race. So why low-income households with children? As many folks in the audience may know, in 2020, the poverty rate was 11.4%, so 37.2 million people in poverty. This number is higher for children, 14.4% of children living in poverty. And these figures are higher for certain populations of color, specifically Blacks, Hispanics, and American Indians. So about a quarter of Black children living in poor households, and about 1 in 5 Hispanic and American Indian children. This group, of course, low-income households, often a focus of policy discussion and debate, a target of policy interventions, including, but certainly not limited to, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, Section 8 housing vouchers, and the like. Some of these programs are also, of course, targeted towards low-income households with children. We can think here about Women, Infants, and Children, WIC, Head Start, and other programs. As Governor Brainard mentioned, this is a population that is potentially most vulnerable to the negative impacts of our current economic context, including the pandemic recovery and inflation, concentrated in the low-wage sectors of the economy that may have seen disproportionate job loss or job disruption, and less wealth, less savings to draw on to offset rising prices, much less discretionary spending, as I'll show today, to cut back on in the context of rising prices. As a sociologist, I'm interested in the empirics of current conditions, but also theoretically, what do they mean? So when we're talking about low-income households with children, we also need to keep in mind potential multi-generational impacts of the current economic conditions, depending on where children are in their developmental trajectories and the different ways that these conditions may shape development of children. The question that guides this work is quite simple. What does a typical month of spending look like for these households? So this is a descriptive question. We're not inferring to a broader population. We're just going to describe an answer to this question using national data. The data that we're using come from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is publicly available from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The primary thing that's done with this data set is BLS uses it to calculate the CPI. But the information, which is a pretty comprehensive data set of information on spending representing all non-institutionalized households in the US, is made available to researchers to use publicly. The data is a rotating panel of households, so households can be in this panel up to 4 consecutive quarters. Today, I'll be sharing results averaged over the period from 2015 to 2019. And the sample here is households that have at least 1 child in the household under the age of 18, and then have an income that is 200% or less of the poverty line. So poor and near poor households as well. For reference, that figure was $42,660 for a family of 3 in 2019. I'm going to spend a little bit of time with this figure, which is a figure from the EconoFact piece, before moving on to another figure that's not in the piece. So this figure is showing 2 things at once. So the y-axis here, so the height of these bars, is the percentage of low-income households with children that reported spending in a given category. So that's the height of the bars. The dollar figure on top of the bars is those households' average spending in that category per month. So this is hopefully putting some numbers on this basket of goods that we've been talking about a little bit today and might continue to talk about throughout the morning. A couple pieces of this that I will note. So first of all, as Governor Brainard mentioned, transportation and the cost of food, just under $700 a month for these families in those categories. These are 2 categories that are seeing rising prices. We can think about how those rising prices might function within this basket of goods. A set of expenditures on children, so things ranging from childcare and education, diapers, infant furniture and equipment, children's clothing, over $400 a month for low-income households with children. We can also think about how prices of those items may have changed, or opportunity costs may have changed as childcare centers close and things of that nature, and families are thinking about trade-offs between work and childcare. Then, as was also mentioned, rent. About 40% of low-income households report expenditures on rent. But for those that do, this is the highest expenditure in the basket, an average of $414 a month. Other households may be paying rent through fully subsidized means, home ownership, live-in with other family members, etc. But this is the highest cost item in the basket. A little bit about the intersection of race and poverty. We don't find differences by race in spending for low-income households across these categories of both necessary and discretionary spending. And I'll show some examples of that in a moment. We just don't see large differences of this type. This also includes no large racial ethnic differences in low-income households' expenditures for discretionary items like eating out, trips and entertainment, alcohol, and cigarettes and tobacco. Although we don't find large racial differences in these baskets among low-income households, it's important to note that Black, Hispanic, and American Indian households are more likely than white and Asian households to be in this low-income category. So the differences that are notable here are about selection into the category, not differences in spending among those in the category. So here are some examples of what that looks like. We have this chart is set up the same way as the other chart that I showed earlier. So we have two things we would consider necessities here: total food and transportation, and two things that might be discretionary: food away from home, so eating out, and trips and entertainment. And we just don't see very large racial ethnic differences in the percentages of low-income households with children that are reporting spending at least $1 in these categories, or in the amounts across those necessary and discretionary categories that we're using here as examples. So to wrap up, food and transportation are both categories with rising prices, have been mentioned. These account for large portions of low-income households' budgets. Hopefully what I've been able to show you is kind of how those items function within the basket of goods. One of the difficulties with data of this type, we're not the first research team drawn into this problem, is it's not always clear whether and how households are thinking about SNAP and WIC spending when they're reporting their food spending. About 30% of low-income households in our study don't report any food spending. We assume that that's because they're using benefits and no out-of-pocket expenditures. It's also possible that families who are reporting spending are including a mix of subsidized and out-of-pocket spending in the amount they report. We're unable to kind of adjudicate those differences. Our study population, our sample, also does include some households that may have incomes high enough to be over eligibility threshold. So there's a mix there, out-of-pocket and subsidized spending on food. Something that's relevant here, food subsidies are adjusted for inflation on an annual basis. So this may be missing some of these mid-year price changes as we're currently experiencing. Again, we're not the first researchers to point that out, but we are the ones who are relaying it today. In transportation and technology, both two big items in this basket for low-income households, not as heavily subsidized as food, but make up large portions of low-income households' budgets. About 3/4 of the expenditures for these households go to necessities: food, transportation, rent, utilities, cell service. We don't find support for any claims of large amounts of unnecessary and discretionary spending for this particular population, which is often part of discussions or considerations about things like unconditional cash transfers. That would unnecessary and discretionary spending would mean a big change in how these households spend. We don't see support for that with the money that they currently have. It's also relevant here that the child tax credit substantially reduced the child policy rate. This is not a study that tests or suggests a single policy solution, but that is a relevant part of the context for this work. I'll stop there. Looking forward to the rest of the panel and the Q&A. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Conwell. We're going to go next to David Argent, Assistant Professor of Economics at Penn State University. And we're excited to welcome Dr. Argent back virtually, as he's also a past visiting scholar at the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Abby. for the invitation. I'll be presenting some joint work with Munsov Lee. He's a professor at the University of California, San Diego. He's also here in the panel, so we will be really happy to answer your questions. So we begin with the observation that usually policymakers, economists, we look at nominal income to try to understand poverty and inequality. But it is true that real income, it's a better measure of standards of living. What is real income? Well, income that is adjusted for inflation. It's not the same if you earn $50,000, but than earning $50,000 and having the prices of your basket of goods rising. Right? And the implicit assumption that we make when we look at nominal income is that households face the same inflation, and that has become available for researchers. Well, we now understand that inflation does not affect households in the same way. In fact, in recent years, the prices that low-income households face have grown faster than the prices that high-income households have been facing. And it is the following graph. Here I'm plotting the price index of low and high-income households over time. Here you can see from the beginning of 2004 all the way to 2019. I'm splitting households in different quartiles of income. The yellow line are the poorest households, those households in the lowest quartile of the income distribution. And the light blue it represents the households at the highest quartile of the income distribution, those households that earn over $100,000 a year. And as you can see, all the households are facing inflation, but inflation is very different across income groups. In fact, you can see that over the last 15 years, inflation disparities have been relevant, at least for the consumer goods that we are exploring in our work. Another thing that you might notice here is that at the very beginning, disparities are not very important, and then they grow over here in this period after 2008, and then they remain stable afterwards. So let me just show you how this difference look when we look at the differences between the highest income quartile and the lowest income quartile. So here the yellow line in this graph shows the differences between the highest income quartile and the lowest income quartile, and you can see the differences are close to zero in 2006, and then they rise around 2008, and they remain high in 2010, and then they start decreasing around 2014, and then they remain stable afterwards. And you can see in this graph also the unemployment rate of the United States. So as you can see, a lot of these disparities arise at the onset of the Great Recession around 2008. They grow around this period when variables like unemployment rate start recovering, and then they go back to, when these variables go back to their pre-recession levels, while inflation disparities stabilize. So inflation disparities among the rich and the poor grow during bad times. That's basically the takeaway of this graph. So why are disparities between income groups arising? Well, first, it's the price of necessities. The prices of necessities increase in bad times, and we know that low-income households devote a higher share of their income to necessities. One way to think about this is that perhaps expenditures in luxuries can be postponed, but expenditures in necessities are harder to be postponed. You can always stop going to the gym, but you cannot stop eating food. You can always postpone eating like a fancy type of milk, but milk is harder to be postponed, right? So the relative prices of necessities, we know that over time, they increase during bad times. Another reason why disparities increase, it's the shopping activities of households, especially the shopping activities of high-income groups. During bad times, high-income groups start finding ways to pay lower prices for identical goods. They might be going to different outlets, they might be using coupons, they might be searching for discounts, so they spend a lot more effort trying to pay lower prices for identical goods. And low-income households do the same, but since during bad times, high-income groups do more of this, they are able to reduce the prices they pay for identical goods. So why is this important during the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, the two stylized facts that I just showed you, inflation inequality increases during bad times, and we just faced a recession during the COVID-19 pandemic. And second, the disparities can take many years to reverse. And this is also relevant in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially for two reasons. One, the prices of necessities also increased during the current COVID-19 pandemic, prices such as groceries. And also because given the current situation of the COVID-19 pandemic, well, new technologies such as e-commerce or online shopping arrives that facilitate finding lower prices. But high-income households are the ones that take advantage of this technology the most. You can imagine that high-income households now are able to compare prices over a broader set of stores when they go online and then find the cheapest price, and low-income households are less, they have a lower ability to do this, perhaps because they have less access to these technologies. As a result, both as the prices of necessities increase and the new technologies that have arisen in this COVID-19 pandemic, we believe that inflation disparities could be relevant not only now as we try to overcome the pandemic, but also going forward. And yes, that's what we have to say for today. We're happy to get your questions.
Fantastic, thank you, David. And yes, as David suggested, feel free to enter questions into the Q&A box. We will also be passing them to our moderator for asking panelists later in the conversation time. So just as they occur to you, throw them in there, and we'll work to get to those in the discussion. So I am excited next to welcome Raven Malloy, who is Assistant Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. I know Dr. Malloy well, as we've worked on a number of projects together studying the labor market. But today she's going to share her deep expertise on the housing market with us and talk to us about rent growth and inflation in the cost of housing over time. Okay, take it away.
Thank you, Abby. I'd like to thank you and everyone else at the Institute for putting this event on. I do think it's very important that we think about how inflation differs for different groups in the United States. And I'd also like to thank you for inviting me to present my work on this topic. So this research is joint work with Daryl Larson, and I need to remind everyone of the standard disclaimer that nothing I say is necessarily the view of anyone else in the Federal Reserve System. There we go. Okay, so our research continues the theme of examining how inflation differs across households, specifically looking across segments of the income distribution. And we're going to be focusing on the component of inflation that's related to housing, which is rent. Now, rent accounts for more than 25% of household expenditures in the CPI, so it has a very large weight in aggregate inflation. The housing component of inflation can differ across segments of the income distribution for one of two reasons. One is if rent growth differs across groups, and then the other is if housing expenditure shares differ across groups. These housing expenditure shares matter because they're the weights that we use for rent growth when calculating aggregate inflation. So in our research, we look at both of these measures to see how they vary across different segments of the income distribution, and then we look at the implications for aggregate inflation. So before I get to the results, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about why we focus on rent when we think about inflation. It starts from the point of view that for many purposes, inflation attempts to measure changes in the price of goods and services that households consume. So for housing, that means measuring the prices of housing services, because when we live in a home, we're consuming those services. I want to be clear that by housing services, I mean the shelter and amenities that a housing structure provides. These services are a basic necessity of human welfare, and that's why it's so important that we think about these services when we think about the welfare of people in our society. Now, the price of housing services can be measured directly with rent. That's pretty straightforward, but for about 2/3 of housing units in the United States, they're owner-occupied, and so we can't observe rent directly for those units. Owner-occupants do also pay for housing services, however, they just do so indirectly in the form of the cost of owning a home. These costs are things like homeowners insurance, property taxes, maintenance, and so on. Now, theory tells us that if you add up all of those different pieces of all of these user costs, then you're going to, they add up to the price of housing services. But in practice, a lot of these costs are very difficult to measure with any degree of precision. And so for our research, we're going to be using rents to measure the price of housing services for households in each segment of the income distribution. I should note that the CPI also uses rent to measure the price of housing services in its approach. So one way to think about our analysis is it shows how the CPI would differ across segments of the income distribution if we allow these two components of housing costs to vary across groups. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is how rent growth varies across the income distribution. So here, what I'm showing is 2-year changes in rent for each quintile of the income distribution, where we're showing the median across all households within each quintile. And these data go from 1985 to 2019, and they're from the American Housing Survey. It turns out that rent growth has been pretty similar across these groups. For all groups, rents decelerated fairly minor. So if we take an average over our whole sample period, we find that, that the differences across groups only amount to a few tenths of a percentage point per year. So these differences are just pretty small. We find larger differences if we look at differences in housing expenditure shares across groups. So that's what this graph is showing here. These are data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is the same survey that Jordan was showing us data from earlier. Here you can see that lower income households do tend to spend a larger share of their consumption basket on rent. So for the lowest income quintile, they spent roughly 35% of their expenditures on rent in 1985, and that's increased to more than 40% in recent years. It's interesting to note that these housing expenditure shares have been increasing for all income groups, which shows that housing is becoming a more important share of inflation for all households. So we can put these two pieces together and look at the implications for aggregate inflation. To do so, we're going to calculate inflation as a weighted average of the change in rent and the change in the price of all other goods and services, where the weight for rent growth is the housing expenditure share, and the weight for all other goods and services is just 1 minus the housing expenditure share. We're going to allow both rent growth and housing expenditure shares to differ by income group, but we're going to assume that the price of all other goods and services is the same across groups. We've seen already that that's not necessarily the case, but we want to make this assumption in order to isolate the piece that just comes from housing. So here are the results. And it turns out that we find that our measure of inflation has been very similar across groups over our sample period. The average annual increase in inflation has been basically 2.7% for each income quintile. If we accumulate these increases over our entire 34 sample period, the price level increased by about 137% for the lowest income quintile and about 134% for the top income quintile. These differences are very small compared to the large increases in prices that we've seen over time. Now, our data will end in 2019, and of course, I'm sure many of you are wondering what's happened during the pandemic. You may have heard that rent growth has picked up considerably during the pandemic, and it would be nice to know how that might have differed at different points in the income distribution. So we can't look at this directly because we don't have data yet on rent growth linked to the incomes of the individuals living in those units. But we can still get an idea by looking at rent growth according to neighborhood income in 2019. So these are going to be data on asking rents for multifamily apartments from RealPage. And I do want to mention an important caveat, which is that there's a fair amount of income heterogeneity even within the same neighborhood. So the results that I'm going to show you are going to tend to exacerbate the differences across groups relative to what I showed you earlier. Hopefully, you saw that rent growth in the early part of the pandemic was lower for neighborhoods at the lower end, at the top end of the income distribution. And that's not surprising because we know that there was a large drop in demand to live in large, dense cities early in the pandemic, and higher income people tend to congregate in those and tend to live in those neighborhoods. Those trends reversed in 2021 to some extent, where we saw faster rent growth at the top income quintile, and then rent growth has been roughly the same over the past 6 months or so for across all different types of neighborhoods. So accumulating over the whole pandemic, it turns out that rent growth has been pretty similar for the bottom 4 quintiles of the income distribution, but still somewhat lower on net for the top of the of the top of the income distribution. So these results suggest that at least inflation may have been a little bit lower for higher income households during the pandemic, at least as far as housing is concerned. So could you go to the next slide, please? Great. Okay. So that's all I had to show. To conclude, we showed that allowing rent growth and housing expenditure shares to differ by income group does not turn out to have a material effect on estimates of inflation, at least from 1985 to 2019. There's a lot more further work that needs to be done. Of course, we'd like to look in more detail about what happened during the pandemic. We'd also like to explore why differences in rent growth across groups were not larger. We might have expected larger differences because average rents have been rising much faster in large cities, and we know high-income people are more likely to live in those cities. But it turns out that that didn't actually translate into higher rent growth rates at the household level. And then finally, researchers should explore differences in price growth for other types of goods and services beyond housing and the other categories that have been used in prior research. Those are generally food and other household items. And if you combine all of these categories, they still account for less than half of the total consumption basket. And so there's still a lot of other types of goods and services for which we don't yet know how inflation might differ across different types of households. So thank you again for inviting me to present today, and I'm looking forward to the rest of today's discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Raven. And an excellent technology switch on the fly. We all need to do that. And that was great. So I'm excited to welcome Felipe Schwartzman onto the screen as our final panelist and presenter, and actually another Fed system colleague. So Dr. Schwartzman joins us from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, where he is a senior economist, and he'll be talking about a piece of some joint work with other Fed colleagues and also with Munsab Lee, who will be joining us in the panel conversation starting in just a few minutes. Go ahead, Dr. Schwartzman.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you all for having us here presenting this work. That's joint with Moon. He's the eminent grease of this panel. It's the second paper in which he is involved, and Claudia Macaluso, who's my colleague at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. I'm kind of fortunate to go last. I think people have touched on a lot of things that I was going to talk about, and Governor Brainard, I think, summarized a lot of the things as well. With all that said, these are our views. They do not reflect the view of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. So this is just us researchers trying to noodle about some of these issues. Okay, so first I wanted to talk a little bit about, just as a background, the price stability goal that the Federal Reserve System has, right? So the Federal Reserve Act tells us that we should strive for maximum employment and also stable prices. And when we think about stable prices, in kind of common conversations, we tend to focus a lot on average inflation, right? So is it 2% every year? Is it 5% every year? 10% every year? 2 sounds better than 10. And this is kind of the Federal Reserve's target. But there's another issue, which is how inflation moves around, right? And economists worry a lot about that. Typically, higher inflation tends to come with more volatile inflation. That is inflation that moves around more. So if inflation is on average 6%, you might expect it to be 4% one year, but 8% the other year. This makes prices more unpredictable. It makes it harder for households to plan. Wages are typically somewhat sticky. You make some wage negotiations, and you're going to be stuck with a certain nominal wage for some time. And if you wake up in the morning and you find that gas prices are much higher, you just have to either consume less gas or consume less of something else in order to make up for that. So this volatility is actually something that we worry about. What I'm going to present here is based on this paper with Claudia and Moon, where we're specifically interested in the trade-offs between inflation and unemployment stabilization when it comes to different racial groups. The focus on this kind of racial differences, apart from this being kind of a natural way to look at American society, given all the disparities that exist, is also because one particular disparity for these two groups is in unemployment rates. So we wanted to kind of also think about, okay, what kind of disparities might there be on the inflation front? So, and I think the key idea here is, again, something that Governor Brainard touched on, and I think others talked about, food and energy prices are particularly volatile, right? So these are, I guess that's an example. There are other prices like that, but, I think this is a good and important example, right? These are commodities. They're sold in very competitive markets. Your local gas station, they need to kind of pay refineries some price that is pretty much, tied to like the international price of oil. And they do not have a whole lot of pricing power. So their prices are going to adjust every day if they are going to make a profit. Whereas service prices, such as, health or education, they're placed by hospitals or doctors or universities that may have a little bit more pricing power, a little bit more ability to kind of plan in advance. And they will change their prices once a year, sometimes once every 2 years. And the key thing is Black and white households are going to dedicate different shares of their expenditures to different types of goods and services. That's, of course, something that has to do with what Jordan talked about earlier, which is they have on average different income levels, and people with different income levels will buy different kinds of goods. So here are some examples. These are goods where Black households will devote a proportionately larger share of expenditures than white households. So of course, Black households being poorer, they're going to buy less of everything. But if you look at how they kind of split, their expenditures in different goods, they're going to be more focused on, say, electricity, as compared to other goods, right? And here we just put the average price duration for these different goods. So electricity companies will adjust their prices every 2 or 3 months, whereas like perhaps rather services providers every 7 to 8 months. Bus systems on intracity mass transit more generally, they would change prices very infrequently every 4 years. But by and large, right, Black households are purchasing goods that have prices that are adjusted very frequently. This is, of course, not the whole story when it comes to thinking about how much these prices move around. It could be that, electricity utility providers adjust the price of electricity every few months by only a little bit. But it's going to be an important piece of it. And of course, if you think your underlying costs are more likely to fluctuate, you're going to adjust your prices more frequently and by more. So I think this captures, something important about, the volatility, underlying volatility of these different prices of these different goods. This is, the kinds of goods that white households will purchase relatively more than Black households. So you see like health services, you'll see, pet related expenditures, club dues and things like that, for full service meals, so eating outside. And, as you can see, these are goods that their prices tend to change less frequently. So typically closer to a year or sometimes, even 2 years. So I think that kind of gives us like some kind of notion about the ways in which, white households are a little bit more insulated from inflation movements, at least over shorter horizons than Black households. So in the paper, we translate this into actual changes, differences in volatilities of the prices, price indices. So again, as Governor Brainard mentioned in her remarks, you want to take like a weighted average of, the prices of different goods, and you want to weigh them by how much the households kind of spend in these different goods. And, when you think about like a broader category, such as, particular kinds of food, every day there could be some price change in that index because the price of some food is changing somewhere, right? So you do that work, right? Or we did that work. And what we get is that inflation volatility for Black households is about 8% higher than for white households. To give you a sense of what that means, this is a back of the envelope calculation. But if you think that over a particular year, white households experience inflation as something like 7%, you might expect Black households to experience inflation of 7.5%. 7% is not too far from the kind of numbers we've been seeing year over year recently. So I guess that ties a little bit to the pandemic. This calculation does, it's kind of what the typical disparity would be. It does not take into account that, say, geopolitical events may be driving energy prices to go up by even more than they would normally as inflation moves around. So to summarize, I mean, when we talk about price stability goal, this is also about keeping the inflation rate stable, not just prices stable. So we don't want inflation to be 2% one year and 10% the other. Black households, again, being poor, will spend relatively more on goods whose prices change a lot, because these are goods that tend to be more like food and energy and these kind of things, and relatively less services. And I think just to conclude, when we think about inflation and stability and the cost that this generates, we should take into account that this is also like unemployment borne disproportionately by the more disadvantaged group. So this is something that as policymakers, we need to be mindful of. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think we'll now welcome our panelists all on screen together. And we are really fortunate to be joined by Greg Ip, who is Chief Economics Correspondent, commentator at the Wall Street Journal. And he'll be moderating this session, putting questions to our panelists, connecting pieces of their work, and also, when possible, drawing on the great questions I already see in the Q&A. So please continue to submit those if you have them, and we'll draw from them in this conversation. Okay, Greg, I'm excited to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Abby, and thank you, Neil, for organizing the event. And I'm very pleased and honored to be participating in it today. And I learned a lot from Governor Brainard's speech, and I learned a lot from the panel discussions here. And hopefully we can draw out a little bit more detail and make the conclusions and implications even more interesting for the audience here. And just to follow up on what Abby said, if there's a question you want to ask, you can drop it into the Q&A, and we will have some time towards the end of this session to hopefully get to that. But I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists a question that came to me while I was listening to the presentations, and I hope I can learn a little bit more. Jordan, I'd like to start with you. You touched on this towards the end of your presentation. You pointed out that in your findings, for example, some families report no spending on food, and you suspect that might be because that they're using SNAP, right? They're using in-kind transfers. And indeed, it's an integral part of the US safety net that we actually do have a variety of in-kind transfer programs where we have Section 8 housing vouchers, we have Medicaid for health, and we have SNAP for food. To what extent did the structure of these transfers tend to insulate lower income families from the vagaries of inflation? What do we know about that? And what are the implications for policy if we're trying to protect these more vulnerable households from inflation?
So, we didn't go into this kind of descriptive work thinking specifically about food. And it turned out seeing the importance of food in low-income households with children's consumptions baskets. And then obviously, as this was kind of going to print, we began thinking a lot nationally about the price of food. So there is kind of, first of all, this kind of methodological issue that I mentioned and that you touched on. And we're not the first researchers who have used the Consumer Expenditure Survey who have pointed this out. When you ask a household, technically a consumer unit in the parlance of the CEX, how much do you spend on food? It's not necessarily clear how that household is counting or not counting SNAP or WIC. They could be not counting that. And so, there are 30% of low-income households don't report any spending, but they also could be including that as money and giving an amount. We spend $300 and that might include the subsidy. So that's less clear. And again, others who have worked with this data set have kind of tried to grapple with that as well. In terms of inflation, one of the things that we learned in doing some more digging into how these benefits work, they're adjusted, but they're adjusted annually, right? And so if we have mid-year changes in the prices of goods like food, if they're rapid, like the one that we're experiencing right now, the benefit is not tagged to that. And again, we're not the first to point that out. Diane Schanzenbach, who's an economist at Northwestern, who studies this issue as well, has noted this. So obviously there's a subsidy, but the benefit offers less protection than it could if it was, for example, tied to inflation in a short. So the suggestion that others have made about that is tying it to a shorter period. So don't adjust it annually, adjust it in some shorter period. Obviously, there are costs to that as well in terms of figuring that out and making that change. But there are suggestions on the table to make the current benefit more responsive and more protective than it already is.
And also, on a related question, do we know what proportion of low-income families access those benefits and what share of their related expenditures are covered by those benefits?
So there are criticisms. Some of the criticisms of the existing program are that it's not meeting full needs for contemporary families. There are a lot of ways to kind of try to figure out what the data would look like for that. One, kind of working the problem backwards is to look at changes in the usage of, say, food banks and food pantries and things like that. And there has been some work that has looked at that and seeing, especially recently, usage of those kind of services is going up, which we would take to indicate places where subsidies and other things are falling short.
Good point. Thanks. David, question for you. So your research on the effect on the varying inflation experience during recessions focuses heavily on the Great Recession. To what extent do you think what you observed in that period can be generalized to all recessions? And in particular, what do we know about the last recession? And what I should actually amend that a little bit, not just the last recession, which as we know only lasted 2 months, but the entire pandemic period.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a very good question. So the result that the prices of necessities increase, the relative prices of necessities increase during bad times has been documented over the last 5 recessions, so since the 1970s. So that I think it's a robust fact of the data. The effect on the shopping behavior of households, for that fact, we rely on what we call scanner data sets, which rely on households scanning what they purchase, so that we understand not only which prices they pay, but where do they purchase these items, and whether they use coupons or whether they find these items on sales. That behavior we can only document for the last 15 years when this data is available. So it's an added feature of the data that we are able to observe only for the previous recession, 2008. Now, for the current COVID-19 pandemic, we have some preliminary estimates. Several researchers have collaborated with these types of firms, the firms that provide these data sets to us, scanner data sets, and they have documented that inflation inequality also increased during at least the first year of the pandemic, 2020. Unfortunately, we don't have more recent data available yet, but we believe a lot of these patterns exist also in the current pandemic. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know also that if Munso wants to add.
Yeah, let me just add one thing on the top of David's answer. So here in this panel, we look at the different inflation rate for the many different demographic characteristics and the many different product categories. So it is very important to collect all those information because we were looking at the by income group and in the consumer goods sector. So that made us to be able to document several of the things the Governor Brainard spoke in the keynote speech, say the caviar versus canned tuna, or the brand name versus the lower priced store brand. So unfortunately, the data doesn't go far the more than the Great Recession, but we believe that also happened in other recessions, but we are very looking forward to the understanding more whenever the data becomes available. So looking at this, the fine detailed level, the substitution behavior.
Actually, you brought up something and I want to drill down on just a little bit, which is how you define necessities. So when you're sort of looking at the different consumption baskets of higher and lower income households, food is a necessity. So do you just look at food in general, or do you actually try and within the food category assign certain types of food to high income and certain to low income? To use Governor Brainard's example, do you therefore account for the fact that while tuna and caviar are both food, they might have different price behavior and therefore different implications for the consumer goods?
Yeah, that's exactly why we looked at the consumer goods sector. So we looked at within the product category across the product quality variation, say the caviar versus the canned tuna,
or the brand name versus lower price the store brand. And even more than that, the low income households are typically going to the $1 store. So the low quality, the store. So we can also think about the store quality substitution. So both in the product quality and the store quality sense, the low income households were kind of the minded below even before the Great Recession. So in addition to their tight budget, so they had a limitation to substitute their consumption behavior during the recession.
Okay, great. Raven, a question for you. One of the things that you note in your paper is that for all income groups, housing consumption has been growing as a share of total consumption. In fact, I think it's grown more for lower income people, if I remember your numbers correctly, right? Why is that? What is driving this secular rise in housing expense as a share of consumption? Do we know how much of that is driven by quality versus price? And, play this movie forward for us. Is that trend likely to continue? Will we eventually spend 100% of our incomes on housing? And if so, what are the implications?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think for sure, some of the increase in the kind of housing related expenditures that we've seen has been an increase in the quantity of housing consumed in terms of kind of people are living in much larger houses than they used to live in. Houses with more bathrooms, just nicer amenities. And that can, over our sample period, that can explain roughly half of the total increase in housing expenditures. So if you look at like average rents, those increased by about 230% for the typical household, whereas a quality adjusted measure increased by less than 100%. So a lot of the increases in housing expenditures that we see are because people are consuming more housing. But of course, also the price of housing in terms of both house prices and rent has been increasing, and rents have been rising faster on average than the prices of other goods and services as well. So that's another reason why the expenditure shares are growing, is just relative to other goods and services, what we think of as the real price of housing has just increased for everybody. And there are lots of potential reasons for that, including, limits on the supply of housing and increases in demand to live in certain areas where it's hard to build and things like that.
And what's the outlook? Should we probably assume that this trend will continue? When you look at the underlying drivers of these consumption shares, is it likely those consumption shares will likely to increase and therefore rent will play an ever-growing role in people's inflation experience?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a lot of the factors that are driving these long-run trends are going to be pretty persistent. I mean, obviously, we can't spend all of our income on housing, so that's got to stop at some point. And you can imagine that once housing gets expensive enough, people are going to have to dial back the quantity of housing that they consume. We're not going to continue to increase the size of homes that we have, to the same extent that we did have over the past couple of decades. As housing gets more, like we've been talking about before, substitution will happen. So as housing gets more expensive, people will shift down to, live in smaller units, live in, less expensive locations, things like that. So it could continue for quite a while, but I would imagine that at some point it should level out as people realize that they still need to spend money on food and transportation and other things too.
Okay. Felipe, I want to ask you a question, and actually this question is also for David and Mansub, because it relates to, I think, a sort of a dichotomy that I noticed between your paper and their paper. Your paper finds that Black households tend to experience higher inflation in periods of high inflation. When inflation is rising, it tends to rise more for Black households. And on a cyclical basis, we would expect that to happen in economic expansions. On the other hand, David's paper and Mansub's paper finds that in recessions, inflation for lower-income households is higher. Now, I know Black households and low-income households are not the same thing. There is some overlap, but they're not the same thing. Nonetheless, since we know that there's a slightly higher proportion of Black households who are low income, am I right that there's a little bit of a tension or a dichotomy between these two findings? It sounds like that this group of people are suffering higher inflation both during recessions and expansions. And I'm not sure how we reconcile those two facts.
Right. I think that's an excellent question. And I think this is something that, we need to dig into, right? I mean, my first pass answers to you is first, it is not entirely true that inflation is higher in expansions and lower in recessions. So, I mean, I think notably in the 70s, right, you had like inflation spikes that had to do with like, the big oil shocks. And, these were also associated with recessions. The Great Recession, did see some of that dynamics. And, we need to dig a little bit further. The data is different that we're using. We're using broader categories here, whereas like in the paper with David, Moon and David are using like narrower categories. They have this whole issues about the trading down, which is not something we capture. Now, the trading down aspect is something that I think it's interesting because you can imagine that working in both directions, right? So as unemployment goes up and you're kind of more vulnerable, you might trade down. And as inflation goes up and your real wage, falls behind, you may also want to trade down. So there's a sense in which some of those dynamics that they're capturing are ones that are going to insulate more affluent households, in both directions, whatever is happening. Again, I don't think that's a complete answer. And I think, it's something, all of this is work in progress and it's very new. And I think we have to kind of think a little bit harder about that.
David or Moon, would either of you like to address the question?
Let the common factor of the two papers, take.
Yeah, so I will
correct.
emphasize the once again. So it is very important to collect and combine all the different evidences coming from the multiple sectors. I mean, coming back to the Laban's, the presentation. So the her team couldn't find the significant difference across the income group, but that's in the housing, the rent, the sector. But on the other hand, we found the large difference in the consumer goods sector. And then our difference was mostly driven by the trading down or the change in the shopping behavior. The within category, across the product or the barcode level substitution. So I don't think those are somewhat, I mean, there may be some tensions, but understanding the differences across the research and then the different mechanisms, where the different inflation rates are coming from. So then I don't think those are contradicting to each other. But again, I want to emphasize once again, so we want to look at the multiple sectors, the multiple demographic, the characteristics to understand, to have the better picture about the sources behind the inflation inequality.
Okay, that leads me to my next question. And Felipe, I'll start with you, but this question actually is for the entire panel. I'd love all of you to take a stab at it. We are being hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Many of you work in the Federal Reserve System. So an obvious question to ask is, what are the implications of your research for the conduct of monetary policy? In fact, I'd like to read the question that was submitted during Governor Brainard's speech by David Wilcox. Many of you know David. He was a longtime colleague of yours in the Federal Reserve System. He asked, how does the diversity of inflation experiences across the population inform the conduct of monetary policy? In real life, do you make different decisions than you would if everyone experienced the same inflation rate? And I think this is especially relevant because our central bank, the Fed, has a dual mandate, which is both maximum employment and stable prices. And at different times, it will emphasize different parts of that mandate. Given what we've been told about how inflation is experienced by different income groups, does that suggest that all else equal, one might want to put greater weight on the inflation side of the mandate? And I will, putting my cards on the table, Philippe, that is the lesson I draw from the final slides of your presentation. But then there's a whole other piece here, which this panel has not really been charged with addressing, which is the employment side, because there are aspects of unemployment, which also we know have historically fallen harder on lower income families. So I'll start with you, Felipe. How do these findings, do you think, how should it inform what the Fed does and how it interprets its mandate?
Greg, thanks a lot. I mean, well, I'll repeat the disclaimer. None of that reflects the vision of the Federal Reserve. This is just me, trying to answer your question. But I think broadly speaking, you're right. I mean, we think about the unemployment goal as being an inclusive goal, and rightly so. And, there has been focus on the fact that there are very large disparities in unemployment rates across groups. So this is why we focus on the racial difference, because that's one where this is particularly salient. But I think, what I take from our research is that the inflation goal also is inclusive in itself, and we have to think about the trade-off hard. So in our paper, we are actually directly trying to look into the trade-off. And I think the general idea or the general sense is, while you can keep inflation stable, right? I mean, stabilizing unemployment is a great thing. But it is imperative to keep inflation stable. So a stagflationary situation like we had in the 70s, where in the end of the day, in order to stabilize inflation, the Fed had to hike rates by a large amount and generate very large unemployment rates, was bad, not just because of the unemployment rates that were generated in that hike, but because before that hike happened, poorer households were more at the mercy of large price fluctuations. So it's kind of the worst of all worlds. And there's a sense in which, I think that research highlights why you want to really be vigilant about, keeping inflation on target, on a stable way over longer horizons at least. Because among other things, that allows you to smooth the shocks, right? So we saw like oil shocks happened, in the past decades, in that, we allowed them to kind of get into prices without affecting unemployment. But this is something that's a luxury that we have when we're not in the stagflationary environment.
Raven, do you want to take a crack at this?
Sure. I do think Governor Brainard said it very well when she said that one reason why we should care and think about it is that our monetary policy tools can probably affect some types of inflation better than others. And so knowing, like, say that, housing inflation is relatively similar across groups versus, food or oil price inflation, which might not be, I think is helpful, is just helpful to know in terms of how we think about inflation affects different groups. Our monetary policy tools are very blunt and designed to really affect all people, right? We don't try to help certain segments of the population or different, or different segments of the economy. Nevertheless, it is helpful to understand that there are still widely different experiences experienced by different households, and then that can then in turn have aggregate implications for later. So, for example, even if inflation were pretty low on average for many households, if there was a tail of households that were experiencing very high inflation, then that could then in turn have important economic consequences for the whole economy. So definitely something that we need to be paying attention to and thinking about.
Thanks. David, did you want to take a crack?
I just wanted to say, the way I think about it is, imagine the Fed trying to conduct monetary policy to stabilize prices without observing inflation. What's the actual number, right? And this is the way it used to be done before, back in the day. And then the Fed and statistical agencies have been exerting great effort to try to measure inflation, right? Now, better information or more information is just better for the Fed to make more informed decisions. And this is part of that agenda. There's a lot of work that some of us in the panel have done also to try to measure inflation more accurately. And this is not a simple task. Just imagine trying to get a sense of what's the price of every good in the economy and how that changes over time. So I see that as a task of providing information to the actors like Governor Raven or Neil Kashkari, who was here, just to try to inform them better so that they can make better decisions. And I think that's part of the agenda here.
Thanks. Jordan, the next question actually will be for all of you. I want to start with you, Jordan. And one of the things that sort of struck me about some of the slides you showed is that you had one slide that showed what proportion of particular goods are generally consumed by low-income families. At the very top was cell phones. Like there's no commodity that is more important to low-income households than cell phones. And I don't know if that's something that we typically consider a necessity. David and Moon, I assume that was not part of the basket of necessities that you tracked in your research. Am I correct? So my question is, do we need to have a fairly dynamic definition of what constitutes a necessity? Obviously, if we were doing this panel 30 years ago, nobody would have said a cell phone was a necessity. Today, I think most people would say their cell phone is a necessity. I mean, try to drag a cell phone away from most people. Definitely don't try it with my teenage son. do we need to update our concept of what a necessity is? And maybe that would change some of our findings. I mean, I would point out that generally speaking, cell phone service plans have been declining. And David and Moon, you both pointed out that one of the reasons high income families tend to adjust better to high inflation periods is that they are more likely to use these technological tools to find better deals. So let me just put that question to you. Do we need a more modern concept of what represents a necessity? Jordan, let me start with you.
Yes, we might want to call it dynamic, but I don't know how dynamic we need to be to consider a cell phone a necessity. It's been a necessity for quite some time. When we went into this, we were not expecting to see such a role for cell service, but obviously it's very important. And as we've heard throughout the day from the beginning, when Governor Brainard was making remarks and some of our other panelists here about the importance in dealing with these conditions of having access to do just basic online shopping. And obviously, we've also seen, if we want to think in the case of our research about households with children, the necessity not just of cell phone service, but stable and high quality broadband and internet connections for education and other purposes. The digital divide has never been clearer than it has been in the last couple of years. Broadband access is lightly subsidized, but certainly this is a necessity for households.
Anybody else want to address that?
Let me just add one more point. So here we had a detailed discussion about the different consumption bundles across the household. But one thing we have a less understanding is their time use. So now many American households are spending their time a lot on the streaming service. So also looking at the time use, and if there is any disparity across the demographic characteristics, and then how the price of the streaming service increases. Now we have a huge competition, but maybe we will see some monopoly or oligopoly in that industry that happened in the new technologies. So I just want to add one more point that, so there are many ways of looking at the American households, their different experience. But what we are having the relatively less understanding is how their time use is in general different across the income group, and then what is the implication of that on the inflation inequality.
Great, thanks very much. There are several, I'm going to ask a few questions now from the audience, and several people have asked about regional differences in inflation. And I'm just wondering if any of the panelists have any thoughts on whether some of the income differences that you find are actually reflections of regional differences, or the extent to which regional differences are more important than income differences are, or that households, low-income households in certain regions do quite a bit better than low-income households in other regions. I'm just going to put that question out there. Does anybody have any initial thoughts on that? Actually, let me start with you, Raven, because obviously location, as we know, in housing, it's location, 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 right? So is it likely that regional differences are far more salient to people's inflation experiences than income levels when it comes to rent?
Yeah, I mean, so there are clearly big differences in rent levels across locations and rent growth, right? So that's been happening for decades now, and I don't think that the pandemic will probably seems to have changed that much on that yet. So the question kind of becomes how much substitution is there across different locations in different neighborhoods. So to the extent that people are free to move, and just like any other good, they shift from one type of good to another. When the prices change, they can do the same thing for housing and choose to live in a different neighborhood or a different metropolitan area if they decide that the rents are getting too high in the place where they originally are. So I think that's an interesting question to think about, is the extent to which people have been shifting, across locations in response to, growing rent differentials. So, I do. So, I don't think we found much a big difference in our results if we look at if we divide people by income, relative to their local income, rather than looking at different cuts of the national income distribution. Nevertheless, I do think it's important to kind of think about how people move, how people might be moving around in response to these big differences in rent growth rates.
Well, one question I have for you, Raven, since we're on this, is to what extent does the data you looked at capture the price difference for otherwise similar or identical housing units? So, for example, it's well known that, if I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and it's well known that the further out, that if you live outside the Beltway instead of inside the Beltway, you get way more house for your money. And I assume that there's a certain aspect of that holds true across not just geographies, but incomes and so on. That is it possible that people of different income levels are paying different amounts of money for essentially identical housing services? And if so, how does that affect your findings?
Yeah, so I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but in the paper, we did kind of just look at the level of rents and how that differs across income groups. They're very, very large. Just if you just look at the raw data, the top quintile of the income distribution spends, I think, more than 150%. Their rent, rent is about 150% higher than people in the bottom of the income distribution. And some chunk of that can be explained by just living in larger, higher quality units. But even if we control for the wide array of housing unit characteristics, as well as for some rough location measures, there's still pretty large differences in average rent across income groups on the order of, I think, if I remember correctly, maybe 70 or 80% between the top and the bottom income quintiles. So there are big differences in levels. It's just that when you look at changes in rent across group, it looks like the rent growth controlling for quality has actually been pretty similar across the income distribution.
Okay, thanks. Did anybody else want to address the issue of regional differences?
Speaking of this, the regional differences, I mean, as Greg and the Raven already said, the urban versus rural is very correlated with the income. But there are two unique challenges the rural households are facing. The first is that the rural households generally spend more on transportation because they travel the longer distance. So like today, when the energy price increases, so the rural households are gonna bear the more burden. And the second, the significant amount of the rural households in the US are unfortunately living in so-called the food desert. So the low-income household rely more on unhealthy, the high-calorie foods, and they don't have a convenient access to hospitals. So that generates the nutrition inequality between the urban and the rural household. And as the Jordan gave a nice speech, so that would have some intergenerational consequences because the kids living in this food desert are the relying on this unhealthy, the food consumption like their parents. Maybe the Jordan, you may want to add a few more words on this regard.
Yes, Jordan, do you want to take?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things I think I noted was, we're in one economic condition, has multi-generational impacts, and those impacts on children are going to vary based on where children are in their developmental trajectories, right? So as Munsab just mentioned, lack of access to high quality, fresh and nutritious food is going to have differential impacts on children based on their age, right? So it's not just an effect on children, it's an effect on children differently based on nutritional needs, based on other health conditions, as Munsab also mentioned, access to hospitals and that kind of information differing. So that's a really important issue, and it reminds us that we need to think about not just one item, say food or rent or transportation separately, but needing to think about all these things together and how these inequalities that particularly low-income households are facing, the math here is not arithmetic, it's multiplication. So these inequalities are compounding as they link with each other across these different categories of spending.
I want to ask a question. This is actually Abby's suggestion, but it's very good. It is a very good question. And it sort of like gets back to what I was saying, the topic of what does this mean if you're the Federal Reserve and you're trying to run monetary policy? And it has to do with, well, we've seen a lot of very large disruptive relative price changes in the last few years, and rent and housing is one of them, food is another. And of course, one of the main questions facing the Fed is, are we looking at a one-off price level change, or are we actually looking at inflation? And I'm wondering if the panelists have any thoughts on that, because I think it goes to the issue of, to the extent that in the last few years, we have seen lower income households, for example, face higher inflation. Is that generalizable for the future, or does that really just reflect, sui generis aspects of the current cycle, and we should just sort of like set it aside? I should point out the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has suggested that a lot of it is of these one-off varieties. Now, so not to put any of you on the hot spot, but I don't want to presume your answer now that I've told you how your chairman would answer. But Felipe, let me start with you. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's $1 trillion question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have to, this is completely speculative in a sense. I mean, it's a hard problem that some of the best minds in the country are trying to grapple and disagree about. I think we have to kind of, admit the possibility that it could be either, and be prepared for, if this becomes kind of a more persistent inflation. I mean, in some other work, I've been trying to look, into some surveys of like firm expectations and try to look into like the extent to which they're incorporating incoming inflation data into their price projections and their pricing decisions. You do see a little bit of a trend there. Is that enough to kind of imply that this is going to persist and move forward in this kind of like more dramatic way that will be kind of a little bit more scary? Or is that just kind of a smaller thing that has to do with a particular environment we're in? I guess we're going to find out. But in a sense, I mean, I viewed this as kind of like the really, super important question that as policymakers we need to respond. I can't presume to have like a much better answer than, what different people have said right now.
Thanks. Anybody else want to tackle that? Raven, how about you?
Yeah. So I'd like to talk about the housing piece again, my own views, of course. My view is that a lot of the kind of changes that we've seen in the housing market have been because of what you could think of as like a one-off change in people's demand for housing space. The pandemic made people reconsider the type of housing that they want to live in and, the type of location they want to live in. I think it remains to be seen a little bit the extent that those kind of those changes in preferences are going to be permanent versus whether they may change again to back to where they were pre-pandemic as people maybe start returning to the office a little bit more. But also it's going to take, even if you think of this as kind of a one-time fairly permanent change, it's going to take a long time, I think, for it to feed through to the housing market completely, because lots of people don't make a decision right away. They might have this change in preferences but moving costs are very expensive, so they don't sell their house and move somewhere else immediately. They wait for a while, and then after a year or two, when things are still haven't changed and they still have the same preferences, that's when they decide to move. Or they wait, and then when they have their next kid and need to move anyway, they say, oh well, actually now instead of moving to this neighborhood what we would have chosen 3 years ago, we're going to choose this other neighborhood because the pandemic has made it easier to work from home or something. So even if although I think of it as kind of a big shock to people's preferences, it could still take quite a while to feed through into the housing market. And then of course there are all the frictions and rental contracts and things like that, which just cause a lot of inertia in housing market. So it could be quite persistent.
Okay.
Despite the
we're almost out of time here, but I do want to finish off with one question. And it was prompted by, I think, the very first slide that David shared with us, which was that we're not interested in nominal income disparities. We're interested in real income disparities, which is why we care about inflation. But we've only really been talking about one piece of that real income equation today, and that's the price equation. We haven't talked about the income equation. And Governor Brainard shared with us some interesting findings from the Fed's own internal research, which they find that using this ADP data, that lower income people have actually enjoyed the largest nominal wage increases over the pandemic period. This is corroborated by a variety of other findings, including, for example, the wage tracker by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And so my question is, it may be, to the extent that there are differential impacts of inflation by income group, are those impacts amplified or attenuated by differential impacts on income? Now, is the whole system endogenous somehow, or do they happen randomly? Bottom line is, in the last 2 years, is the fact that lower income people have faced higher inflation entirely neutralized and then some by the fact that they've had higher incomes? Anybody want to? I'm not trying to say this is not an issue, but surely we need both sides of that equation to make an intelligent assessment. Who wants to go first?
think I can speak to that a little bit because it's also something we're looking into in our paper. So it is true that, like, again, when we look at the racial differences, wages for Black households move around more than the wages for white households. And, in such a way that actually on average, I think it does make up for a lot of like the inflation disparities. Now, you have to bear in mind, these are averages, right? And for like a very broad heterogeneous group. And, one thing to think about is that a lot of these wage movements have to do with people who are switching jobs or who were unemployed and then got a job, and you're comparing their new wage with, what the wage that they used to have before, they lost their jobs. You might expect people who are kind of keeping their jobs and who are just staying into some kind of autopilot when it comes to, wage increases in their job, may not have the same kind of compensation. So this is something that we haven't looked into with as much care. We try to, there's only so much you can get out of the data. But I think by and large, yes, that's a good question. And I think there's some of that that's definitely going on.
Moon, I saw you nodding. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Maybe
David, go ahead.
Say maybe what he's thinking. Well, we can study it's not only we can study not only income inequality but consumption inequality, and they not always move in the same direction. Income inequality has been rising, whereas consumption inequality might be was actually decreasing. What we found in our study with Munsov is that these inflation patterns that we document reverse a bit of the gains that we have made in the consumption inequality measures in recent years. Of course, this is only looking at the consumption goods sector, and that's a big caveat of that's the trade-off. A lot of detailed data and a lot of information, but only within this sector where we can make these statements.
Anybody else want to talk about the impact of income? Jordan, do you have any final thoughts on that? Okay. All right, folks, I'm going to wrap it up now. It's been a really interesting panel. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for presenting their findings here. And I'm now going to hand it back over to Abby.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, panelists. So before I conclude our event, I do just want to offer a few thank yous. I especially want to thank our teams at the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute and the Minneapolis Fed. They've all worked behind the scenes to make this happen, and this includes, at this time of year, juggling and coordinating our work across a few of the local spring break weeks. So we've had just really great team effort handing things off as people take time out for themselves. And so I'm greatly appreciative of all the work that we've had from our crews. I'm equally grateful to our outstanding speakers and to Greg Ip for moderating a really fascinating conversation. A main goal of this event was to outline some of what we do know about unequal impacts of inflation across American households. But a related goal was to make clear the limits of what we know. And that came up quite a bit as well, especially in our conversation. By understanding these limits, we can help policymakers consider what impacts deserve action and which deserve closer scrutiny. And I think we've actually taken important steps on both of those counts in this conversation. And so I very much appreciate everyone's contributions today. And thank you to our audience for joining us this morning. I hope you'll see our event website for further materials and for the summaries of today's presentations and discussions. And consider signing up to stay in touch with the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute and to receive all of our publications. Thanks again to everyone for joining us.